That morning, I went to the bank for a routine account review after 38 years of marriage. The manager locked his office door, leaned toward me, and whispered, "Do not sign anything your wife gives you. And if your heart medication looks different tonight, don't take it." I thought he had made a terrible mistake. But that evening, my wife placed the pills in my hand and smiled. "Take your medicine, sweetheart." That was when I knew he had warned the right man. You're watching Dad's Revenge Stories, and I'm so thankful for your support. As this architect's world begins to crumble, I want to know who is standing with me. Comment below with your city or country right now. Please note, certain fictional details were added to this story for entertainment, while specific names or locations are coincidental. The core warning here is incredibly useful. There are mornings when something feels off before you can explain why, like a hairline crack in a wall that hasn't shown itself yet, but the house already knows it's there. That Monday in early March, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of the room I'd slept in for 30 years, and I felt it. Not pain, not fear, just a quiet wrongness sitting on my chest alongside the cardiac monitor I wore every night. I was 68 years old, retired architect, bad right knee and a heart that required daily medication, a wearable cardiac monitor strapped across my chest, and more patience than God originally issued me. The monitor was a small wireless device. It recorded my heart's electrical activity around the clock and sent the data automatically each morning to my cardiologist's office. If my rhythm went wrong, an alert would fire. That was the arrangement. That was what I'd trusted for 2 years. I unclipped it, checked the readout. 61 beats per minute. Normal. I set it on the nightstand and reached for my pill organizer, the weekly one Margaret had bought me 3 years ago, each compartment labeled with the day of the week in her careful handwriting. I shook Monday's compartment into my palm. 4 pills. The big white one for blood pressure. The small oval for the arrhythmia. 2 others for things I'd stopped asking the names of. I looked at the small oval one. It sat in the center of my palm, and something about it made me stop. I'd been taking that pill every morning since 2023, and I knew its shape the way I knew the feel of a drafting pencil intimately without thinking. But this one looked slightly different. Not dramatically different. Just a shade lighter. A fraction smaller. I told myself it was the morning light coming gray through the curtains. I told myself pharmaceutical manufacturers sometimes changed their tablet presses, their coating formulas. I told myself a lot of things standing there in my bedroom at 6:40 in the morning. Then I swallowed it anyway, because that's what you do when you're 68, and your heart doesn't always remember how to beat correctly. Downstairs, Margaret's voice floated up the stairwell, warm and easy. "George, honey, breakfast is ready. Don't let the eggs get cold." I pulled on my trousers, my blue Oxford shirt, the brown leather shoes she'd set by the closet door the night before without being asked. That was Margaret. She'd been doing small things like that for 38 years. Noticing what needed doing and doing it before you thought to ask. I used to find it the most natural thing in the world. I found myself noticing it differently now. The kitchen smelled of coffee and scrambled eggs, and the gardenia plant on the windowsill that Margaret tended like it was a second child. She was standing at the stove when I came in, still in her robe, silver hair pinned back neatly, moving the eggs around the pan, with the wooden spatula she'd had since before Derek was born. Nathan, I mean. Our son Nathan. She turned when she heard me, and her whole face brightened. That smile, God, I'd loved that smile for 38 years. Wide and genuine, the kind that reached all the way to the corners of her eyes. "There he is," she said warmly, crossing over to kiss me on the cheek. "You look tired, sweetheart. Did you sleep all right?" "Well enough," I said, settling into my chair at the kitchen table. My knee throbbed its usual morning complaint, and I pressed my palm against it. The monitor beeped around 3. Probably nothing. Her brow creased immediately. Should we call Shaw's office? I already checked the readout. Rhythm was fine. I picked up my coffee mug, the blue ceramic one I'd been drinking from since 1989. Shaw would have called if it flagged anything on his end. She relaxed, setting the plate in front of me. Eggs, wheat toast, half a grapefruit. You have your bank appointment this morning, don't forget. 10 o'clock. I remember. I took a sip of coffee and watched her move back to the counter. You're not coming? I've got the garden club at 9. She waved her hand lightly. It's just the quarterly account review, George. Thomas Reed handles it every time. You won't even need me there. No, I agreed. I suppose not. She came and sat across from me, cradling her own coffee in both hands, and we ate the way we'd eaten breakfast 10,000 times before. She talked about the garden club, about the Hendersons next door, who were finally repainting their shutters, about a documentary she wanted to watch that evening. Her voice moved through the kitchen like it always had, easy, unhurried, filling the space between us the way sunlight fills a room. I watched her hands wrapped around that mug. They were steady. Completely, perfectly steady. You're quiet this morning, she said, tilting her head at me with that particular look she reserved for when she thought I needed managing. Just thinking, I said. About what? I looked up from my eggs and smiled at her the way I'd been smiling at her for nearly 4 decades. About whether the oak tree in the side yard needs trimming before the spring storms come. She laughed that bright, unguarded laugh that had always undone me. Always the architect. She reached across the table and patted my hand. Eat your breakfast. You've got plenty of time before the bank. I ate. I laughed at the right moments. I kissed her on the cheek when I left the way I always did, and she squeezed my arm and told me to drive carefully the way she always did. I backed out of the driveway and pointed the car toward King Street, and the March morning opened up around me, magnolias coming into blossom along the boulevard, joggers on the sidewalks, the whole ordinary, beautiful machinery of a city that didn't know anything was wrong. But in my right palm, I could still feel the ghost of that small oval pill. Lighter than it should have been. A fraction smaller than the one I'd taken the morning before. By the time I reached King Street, I had talked myself out of it and back into it 3 times. The 4th time, I stopped talking myself out of it. Some things you know in your hands before you know them in your head. 40 years of architecture taught me that the way a wall feels wrong under your palm before you find the crack, the way a floor gives just slightly too much before the whole thing fails. You learn to trust that feeling. You learn that when your hands are telling you something your eyes can't see yet, you'd better listen. The light ahead of me turned red. I sat at the intersection with my hands on the wheel and the morning pouring through the windshield, and I thought about the pill. And I thought about Margaret's steady hands around her coffee mug. And I thought about the quarterly appointment at Willamette First National that she had very casually reminded me was today, and very casually suggested she didn't need to attend. The light turned green. I drove. The Willamette First National Bank on King Street was a building I had always respected, clean federal-style lines. Good proportions, the kind of architecture that said we intend to stay and meant it. I'd been doing business there for over 20 years, and I knew the marble floors and the teller windows and the particular smell of cool air and old money, the way you know any place you've returned to enough times that it stops feeling like somewhere you go and starts feeling like somewhere you simply are. Thomas Reed met me at the door. That was the first thing that struck me as wrong. Thomas was the branch manager had been for the past 12 years, a compact, deliberate man in his early 60s, who wore a blue tie every single day, as if he'd made a solemn personal commitment to the color. In 20 years of quarterly appointments, Thomas had never once met me at the door. His assistant always did. Thomas came out when the paperwork was ready. He extended his hand, and his grip was firm and quick, the kind of handshake that's trying to communicate something without saying it out loud. "George, good to see you. Come on back." He didn't take me to the usual meeting room. He took me down a side hallway I'd never been down into a smaller office with no windows, and a door that he closed behind us, and I felt my chest tighten when he did this. He pulled the interior blinds shut on the narrow glass panel beside the door. "Thomas," I said carefully, "you're making me nervous." He didn't smile. He sat down across from me and opened a folder on the desk between us and turned it to face me without saying a word. It was a bank statement. My account, the joint checking account Margaret and I had shared for 31 years. I recognized the account number immediately. What I did not recognize were 6 months' worth of transfers listed down the left side of the page. Small amounts. $300 here, $450 there, occasionally $800. Unremarkable on their own. But they had been happening every week like clockwork since last September. I leaned forward and looked at the recipient column. Hargrove Meridian, LLC. "I've never heard of this company," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Neither have I." Thomas clasped his hands on the desk. "And I've been in this business for 34 years, George. A company that exists only on paper, registered in Delaware, with no public address, no website, and no discernible business activity, that's not a company. That's a container." My hand found the edge of the desk and gripped it. "How much total over the 6 months?" Thomas glanced at the bottom of the page. $14,260. It wasn't a fortune. That was almost the worst part. It wasn't a fortune, it was a test. Small enough that a man with a busy household and a heart condition might not notice. Small enough to stay below the automatic reporting thresholds. Small enough to look like nothing. "Who authorized these transfers?" I asked, though I already knew. My jaw ached from the effort of asking it calmly. Thomas looked at me for a moment, with an expression I recognized, the expression of a man who is about to say something he has rehearsed and still isn't sure how to deliver. "The authorizations came from the joint account, George. Either signature is valid. There's no way for me to tell you which of you initiated each one without a formal investigation, and I can't open a formal investigation without a police report, and I can't file a police report on your behalf without your—" He stopped, exhaled slowly. "I'm not here as your bank manager right now. I'm here as someone who has known you for 20 years and who noticed something that troubled him. That's all this is." My eyes were stinging. I blinked it back hard, furious at my own body for its timing. "You said you couldn't open an investigation, but you can flag transactions, monitor the account." "I've already done that." He said it quietly, like a man confessing something. 3 weeks ago, when I first noticed the pattern, every transaction in or out of that account since then has been documented on our end. I nodded slowly. The sting behind my eyes was fading, replaced by something colder and more durable. Something structural. "Thomas." I looked up at him. "Why are you telling me this personally? You could have sent a letter. You could have called." He held my gaze and his voice dropped half a register. "Because last week a woman came in and requested forms for a unilateral account restructuring. She said her husband had been showing signs of cognitive decline and that she wanted to begin consolidating their finances under a single name." He paused. "She had a letter from a physician supporting the request." The room went very quiet. Or maybe it was just me. Maybe the world kept making its ordinary noises, and I simply stopped hearing them. "What did you tell her?" I said. "I told her I would need to review the request and that she would receive a response in writing. Thomas leaned forward slightly. George, I don't know what is happening inside your house. That is not my business, and I'm not going to pretend I know more than I do, but I need you to hear this clearly. He held my gaze with the absolute steadiness of a man who has chosen his words with great care. Do not sign anything Margaret brings you. Not a single document, not a single form, not until you have had someone else, someone you trust completely, review it first. My hand on the edge of the desk was shaking. Not much, just a fine tremor I couldn't will away no matter how hard I pressed my palm flat against the wood. I looked down at the bank statement again. At the name Hargrove Meridian LLC repeating down the page like a drumbeat. $14,000. 6 months. And a letter from a physician saying I was losing my mind. The physician, I said. My voice came out rough. Did she say who it was? Thomas glanced down at a note beside the folder. A Dr. Elliot Shaw. He's listed as your primary cardiologist. I stood up. My knees screamed and I ignored it, gripping the desk edge to steady myself as I got to my feet. Thomas stood too instinctively. George. Thank you, Thomas. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. My hands were still shaking, but I kept my chin level and my voice even, because a 68-year-old man in a bank office does not fall apart in front of his branch manager, no matter what he has just been told. I mean that. Thank you. He walked me to the side door, not the main lobby I noticed, and shook my hand again at the threshold. His grip this time was different. Not the communicating handshake of 20 minutes ago. This one felt like something being passed between two people standing at the edge of something large. I walked out into the March sunshine. Charleston went on around me the way cities do, indifferent, beautiful, completely unaware. A woman walked a golden retriever past the bank steps. 2 young men in suits argued cheerfully about something over coffee cups. A streetcar bell rang somewhere down King. I stood on the sidewalk and thought about Dr. Elliot Shaw, who had been monitoring my heart for 11 years, and who had apparently, at some point I could not yet identify, decided to do something else with that access entirely. And I thought about the small oval pill I had swallowed that morning, lighter than it should have been, a fraction smaller than the day before. I was afraid to go home. I drove around for 40 minutes before I went home. Not aimlessly, I'm not a man who does things aimlessly. I drove the long way down East Bay Street past the harbor south, where the afternoon light was breaking apart on the water, past the old warehouses and the church steeples, and the ordinary beautiful face of a city that had no idea what I was carrying in the passenger seat beside me. I needed the time. I needed to get my hands to stop shaking before I pulled into my own driveway. By the time I turned onto our street, my hands were steady. My chest was not. But that was between me and my cardiac monitor, and as of this morning, I was no longer certain I could trust my cardiac monitor either. Margaret's car was gone. Garden Club ran until 2 on Mondays, and she always stopped at the Harris Teeter on Rutledge afterward. I had at most 90 minutes. I let myself in through the front door and stood in the foyer of the house I had designed and built in 1994, and I did something I had never done in 30 years of living there. I looked at it like a stranger. Every angle, every surface, every place where something could be hidden that wasn't supposed to be there. I started in the bathroom. The medicine cabinet was exactly as it always was. Margaret's things on the left, mine on the right, the system we'd had since the Clinton administration. I took my pill bottle down from the shelf. Metoprolol succinate 100 milligrams for the arrhythmia. I'd been on it since 2023. I knew this bottle the way I knew my own handwriting. I set it on the edge of the sink and pulled out my phone, scrolling back through my photos until I found what I was looking for, A picture I'd taken 6 weeks ago of my prescription label and the pills themselves, one of those things you do when you're 68 and the doctor keeps adjusting your medications and you want a reference point. I'd taken it without thinking much about it at the time. I was thinking about it now. I shook one pill out into my palm and held my phone next to it. My chest seized so hard I gripped the sink with my free hand to keep myself upright. The pill in my palm was the wrong color. Not dramatically, not red instead of white. Just a shade lighter, almost imperceptibly so. And it was smaller. Maybe 2 millimeters, maybe less. But I had spent 40 years measuring things for a living, and 2 millimeters is not nothing. 2 millimeters is the difference between a wall that stands and a wall that doesn't. Okay, I said out loud to nobody, to the bathroom mirror, to the 68-year-old man staring back at me with a look on his face he didn't fully recognize. Okay. I put the pill back in the bottle. I put the bottle back on the shelf exactly where it had been. I straightened the cap a quarter turn to the right, the way it always sat. Then I gripped the edge of the sink with both hands and breathed through my nose until the shaking in my arms worked its way out and stopped. Then I started moving through the house. I went room by room the way I used to walk a construction site methodically, starting from the top and working down eyes, moving to every corner, every surface, every object that was slightly not where I expected it. In 30 years of architectural work, I had trained myself to notice the thing that didn't belong. A load-bearing wall that had been modified without permits. A beam that was 3 inches short of specification. The detail that looked fine until you knew what to look for. The smoke detector in my study was the thing that stopped me cold. I had installed every smoke detector in this house myself back in 2002 when the originals aged out. I knew the make and model BRK Electronics white housing, the test button on the lower left. I had looked at those detectors 10,000 times from my chair at the drafting table without really seeing them, the way you stop seeing the things that are always there. This one was different. The housing was slightly newer, slightly different profile, and in the upper right quadrant of the face almost invisible unless the light caught it at exactly the right angle, which it was with the afternoon sun coming through the study window at 3:15 in March. There was a lens, 3 millimeters across, maybe 4, set flush with the housing. My legs went out from under me so fast I had to catch the door frame with both hands. Not dramatically, I didn't fall, but my knees buckled like someone had cut the strings, and I stood there in the doorway of my own study, gripping the frame, staring at the thing on my ceiling that had been watching me. I thought about all the evenings I'd sat at that drafting table. All the times I'd talked to myself out loud the way you do when you're working something out. All the times I'd sat in the lamplight looking at old project files and thinking out loud about things a man thinks about when he believes he's alone. My eyes burned. I pressed the heel of my hand against them hard and told myself not here, not in this room, not where whatever was on the other end of that lens could see it. I found 2 more. One behind the picture frame in the living room, a family photo from Nathan's college graduation, all 4 of us squinting into the sun at a campus I could no longer look at the same way. Another tucked behind the base of the lamp on the side table near the front window. I didn't touch a single one. Instead, I went out to the back garden. Margaret's territory tomatoes along the south fence, gardenias near the gate, the old wisteria climbing the back wall that she'd been training for 15 years. No cameras out here. I had checked. I sat down in the iron chair by the rose bed, and I put my face in my hands, and I let myself feel it, all of it, everything I'd been holding at arm's length since Thomas Reed's office. And for about 90 seconds, I was not an architect or a retired professional or a man with a plan. I was just a 68-year-old with a bad knee and a broken heart, and a house full of cameras pointed at a life I apparently no longer owned. Then I heard Margaret's car turn into the driveway. I lifted my face out of my hands. I wiped my eyes with the back of my wrist. I straightened in the chair and picked up the gardening magazine from the side table, the one Margaret always left out there, and I opened it to a random page, and I was reading it completely absorbed when the back door swung open. "George, you're out here." Her voice was warm with surprise, bright with the particular pleasure she always got from finding me somewhere unexpected. "I didn't see your jacket in the hall. I thought maybe you'd gone to Frank's." "Just getting some air," I said, smiling up at her. My voice came out easy, relaxed. I was proud of that. "How was garden club?" "Oh, you know." She set her grocery bags down on the patio table and came over to kiss the top of my head. Her hand rested on my shoulder for a moment, warm, familiar, completely steady. "Eleanor Harris brought those lemon bars again. I told her for the third time that I'm watching my sugar, and she handed me 2 of them anyway." She laughed, shaking her head. "How was the bank?" "Routine," I said. "Thomas says hello." "Good." She picked up her grocery bags. "I'm making pot roast tonight. You looked like you needed something comforting." She went back inside. I sat in the garden for another minute, looking at the wisteria on the back wall, 15 years of patient, careful training, winding itself around whatever structure it was given, becoming so intertwined with it that you couldn't separate one from the other without destroying both. I understood sitting there that I was going to need help, and I understood that I was going to need it before tonight's pot roast was finished. Margaret made pot roast the way she always made it, carrots and potatoes and the good rosemary from the garden, slow cooked since morning until the meat fell apart without being asked. She set the table with the cloth napkins and lit the candle in the center, the way she did when she wanted dinner to feel like something more than a meal. 40 years of small gestures, and I had always loved her for them. That evening, they made my chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with my heart condition. "You're quiet tonight," she said, passing me the bread basket with that warm, tilted head look she'd been giving me since the 80s. "Long day," I said, tearing off a piece of bread. "The bank always wears me out more than it should. You work yourself up over nothing." She reached over and patted my hand. "Thomas has been handling our accounts for years, George. There's nothing to worry about there." "You're right," I said. "There isn't." She talked about the garden club, about Eleanor's lemon bars, about whether the wisteria on the back wall needed professional pruning this spring. Her voice moved through the dining room the way it always had, warm, unhurried, filling every corner. I watched her hands cut her pot roast, and I thought about the bank statement Thomas had laid in front of me, and I thought about the lens I had found in the smoke detector housing of my own study. And I nodded at exactly the right moments and said exactly the right things, and by the time we cleared the plates, I had performed the best dinner conversation of my life. "I'm going to check the Henderson file before bed," I told her, folding my napkin. "Old habit. Won't be long." She waved me off affectionately. "Don't stay up past 10. Your knee gets worse when you don't sleep." I kissed her on the cheek and went to my study and closed the door. For a moment, I just stood there with my back against the door and my eyes on the smoke detector above the drafting table, that small blinking light, steady and patient as a heartbeat. Then I crossed to the desk, sat down, and reached for the cardiac monitor's companion app on my phone, the one that let me review my own data between appointments. It took me 4 minutes to find what I was looking for, and when I found it, my hands went so cold, so fast, that I dropped the phone onto the desk with a clatter that seemed outrageously loud in the quiet house. The firmware had been reset. Not crashed, reset. Deliberately by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Every alert log from the past 3 months had been wiped clean. The device was still functioning, still recording in real time, still displaying normal readings on the screen. But the alert transmission feature, the function that was supposed to fire a notification to Shaw's office if my heart rhythm went critical, had been quietly surgically disabled. If my heart did something catastrophic tonight, no alarm would sound. No alert would reach anyone. Nothing would happen except that I would be alone in this house with a malfunctioning heart and a wife who had made pot roast. My throat closed so completely that swallowing felt like trying to push something solid down a pipe too narrow for it. I pressed both fists flat on the desk and breathed through my nose 4 counts and 4 counts out the way the hospital had taught me after the cardiac event in 2022. The room steadied. My hands unclenched. I reached into the bottom drawer of the drafting table. 2 years ago, when I was consulting on a sensitive renovation project for a law firm downtown, I had purchased a prepaid cell phone, the kind you buy with cash at a CVS, the kind that doesn't connect to your home network or your carrier account, or anything that can be checked from the outside. I had used it twice, kept it charged, and filed it away when the project ended. At the time, I thought I was being professionally cautious. Now I understood I had been saving it for this. I powered it on. One contact saved, Frank Dalton. Frank and I had been friends for 41 years. We'd met at a poker game in the fall of 1983, 2 young men who were both too stubborn to fold on bad hands, and we had been in each other's lives ever since. He had spent 3 decades as a financial investigator, the kind of work that required you to look at money moving through complicated systems and understand without being told exactly where it was going and why. He had retired 6 years ago and moved back to Charleston from Atlanta, and we had lunch every other Tuesday at a Vietnamese place on Upper King Street that he liked, and I tolerated because I liked him. He answered on the second ring. "George?" No surprise in his voice. Frank never sounded surprised. It was one of the things I'd always admired about him, and occasionally found maddening. "I need to talk to you," I said, keeping my voice low and level. "Not on my regular phone. I'm on a prepaid." A pause. Short, deliberate. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I drove around for 40 minutes before I came home today." I paused. "Someone reset the firmware on my cardiac monitor, Frank. The alert system is disabled. They've been moving money out of my account for 6 months into an LLC I've never heard of. And my study has a camera in the smoke detector that I did not put there." The line went quiet for 3 seconds. When Frank spoke again, his voice had shifted into something lower, something that belonged to the investigator rather than the friend. "Have you touched anything, moved anything?" "Nothing." "Good. Firm. Certain. Don't confront her. Don't change your routine. Don't let anything look different from yesterday. Can you do that?" My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my back teeth. I just sat through a pot roast dinner without flinching. "Good man." A breath. "Give me 48 hours, George. I need to pull some things together before we talk in person. Don't call me on your regular phone. Only this number. Frank." My voice dropped even lower, low enough that it barely cleared the ambient noise of the house settling around me. "Is there something you already know, something you haven't said?" Another pause. Longer this time. 48 hours, he said. "Meet me at the Magnolia Coffee on Morrison. Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock. I'll have everything I found." He ended the call. I sat at the drafting table for a long time after that, the prepaid phone face down in front of me, the lamp casting its familiar yellow circle over papers I had no ability to read. Above me, the smoke detector blinked its patient blink. I didn't look at it. Eventually, I turned off the lamp and went upstairs. Margaret was already in bed reading her mystery novel, the way she did every night, half glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked up when I came in and smiled that soft, private smile that belonged only to the end of the day. "Everything okay with the Henderson file?" she asked. "Fine," I said. Nothing that can't wait. I got into bed and lay on my side facing the window. And I listened to her read for a while, the quiet turn of pages, the occasional small sound she made when something surprised her in the plot. The cardiac monitor on my chest recorded my heartbeat in the dark, faithfully and uselessly, sending its data nowhere. At some point, Margaret set down her book. "Good night, sweetheart." Her hand found my shoulder, briefly warm and certain. "Good night, Margaret," I said. She fell asleep before 10, the way she always did. Her breathing slowed and deepened and became the rhythm I had fallen asleep beside for 38 years. I lay awake beside her and stared at the dark ceiling and thought about Frank's pause when I'd asked if there was something he already knew. In 41 years of friendship, Frank Dalton had never once paused before answering a question, unless the answer was something he wasn't sure how to say. Whatever he had found in those 48 hours, I already knew it was going to be worse than the camera, and worse than the pills, and worse than Hargrove Meridian LLC and all its tidy little transfers. I just didn't know yet how much worse. I told Margaret I had a physical therapy appointment at 9. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have standing appointments on Wednesday mornings, though I'd rescheduled this one 2 weeks ago and never mentioned it. She kissed me on the cheek at the door and told me to ask Dr. Peterson about the inflammation in my right knee, and I said I would, and I drove to the Magnolia Coffee on Morrison Street, with my hands steady on the wheel and my heart doing something complicated in my chest that the monitor was no longer equipped to catch. Frank was already there when I walked in corner booth, his back to the wall, the way retired investigators always sat, a cup of black coffee in front of him and a manila folder closed flat on the table. He looked up when I came through the door, and something in his face made me stop walking for half a second. In 41 years, I had seen Frank Dalton look tired, look angry, look quietly devastated after his divorce in 2007. I had never seen him look like this. Heavy, like a man who had spent 2 days carrying something he wished he didn't know. I slid into the seat across from him. "How bad?" He pushed the folder toward me without opening it. "Open it yourself. I'll talk you through it." I opened it. The first page was a financial summary. Nathan's name at the top columns of figures below. Frank had organized it the way he organized everything, chronologically, clearly, without editorializing. I had always admired that about him. Right now, I found it almost unbearable. "Securities fraud," Frank said, his voice low and even. "About 14 months ago, Nathan was involved in a coordinated scheme to inflate the price of a microcap stock through a series of trades across accounts held in different names. A compliance officer at the brokerage flagged it. The man who flagged it, rather than reporting it to the SEC, which would have meant federal charges, decided there was a more profitable arrangement. He blackmailed Nathan," I said. My voice came out flat, scraped clean. "His name is Marcus Webb." Frank tapped the second page. "He's got 2 prior convictions, one for extortion in Georgia, one for aggravated assault in Florida. He started at $8,000 a month. By February, he was at 22. The total outstanding balance as of last week." He paused just barely. $1.5 million. I set the page down on the table. My hand was shaking and I didn't try to stop it. $1.5 million. Nathan. My son, who had shaken my hand with great ceremony at his college graduation because he was 22 and thought handshakes were what men did, and then ruined the whole thing by hugging me anyway. "The deadline?" I asked. "June 15th. Frank looked at me steadily. 10 weeks. I picked up my coffee and drank half of it in one go, needing something to do with my hands, needing the heat of it to cut through the cold that had settled into my sternum. "And they think the house covers it." The house, the accounts, the life insurance. Frank turned to the third page and slid it across. George, I need you to look at this one carefully. It was a copy of a life insurance policy. The insured party, George Arthur Calloway. The policy amount, $3.2 million. The beneficiary, sole beneficiary, Margaret Ann Calloway. The date of issue 14 months ago, almost to the day. The date the scheme against Nathan had started. My eyes burned so suddenly and so fiercely that I had to press 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose and look at the ceiling of the coffee shop for a moment, blinking hard. A country song was playing softly from somewhere behind the counter. A young couple at the next table was laughing about something on a phone screen. The whole ordinary world going about its ordinary business. I didn't sign this, I said, when I trusted my voice again. I would have remembered signing a $3.2 million life insurance policy. I know. Frank's voice was careful. The signature on the application is yours, George, or a very good approximation of it. The policy was obtained through a broker who is no longer licensed in South Carolina. His license was revoked 8 months ago for unrelated violations. I have a contact at the Department of Insurance who confirmed it this morning. I looked at the signature. My name in my handwriting. Except it wasn't. It was close enough to pass a standard review, close enough for a broker motivated not to look too hard. But I knew my own signature, the way I knew my own voice. The loop on the G was wrong. The A was too tall. She forged it, I said. Yes. She forged my signature on a $3.2 million life insurance policy. I said it again, because saying it once didn't make it real. 14 months ago, the same week, Frank said quietly, that Webb first contacted Nathan. The weight of that landed on my chest like a structural beam. Margaret had known about Nathan's situation from the very beginning. She hadn't been informed midway through, hadn't been pulled into a crisis already in motion. She had known from week 1, and she had started building the solution before Nathan had finished reading the first blackmail email. My throat tightened until swallowing became a conscious act. She planned all of it, I said. Every step. It appears so. Frank folded his hands on the table. His knuckles were pale. George, there's one more thing. And I want to be honest with you, this is the part I've been sitting with for 2 days, trying to decide how to say it. I looked at him across the table. His eyes were red at the corners just slightly. Frank Dalton, who I had never in 4 decades seen cry, who had gone through his divorce without shedding a visible tear, whose face I had always thought was made of something more durable than ordinary human material. Tell me, I said. He reached into the folder and took out one final page, placed it face down on the table between us. Didn't flip it yet. The financial transactions, I traced the money Webb received, and separately the money moving through Hargrove Meridian, LLC. They both run through intermediary accounts. He kept his eyes on my face. One of those accounts received a transfer of $180,000 over 8 months. The account belongs to a medical professional, someone with access to prescription systems, someone with the technical knowledge to adjust a cardiac monitor's firmware. He paused. Someone who has been inside your home. My hand went to the table surface, flat, pressing down hard. Shaw, I said. Frank turned the page over. It was a financial summary. Dr. Elliot Shaw. The transfers were there in black and white amounts, dates, the intermediary accounts. Frank had traced them through with the particular patience of a man who had spent 30 years following money through mazes. I stared at the page and my jaw ached from the effort of holding my face together. How long have you known? I asked. I confirmed it yesterday afternoon. Frank leaned forward. George, I want you to hear me. Whatever else is on that page, whatever else Shaw is, we are going to deal with it. You are not alone in this. I nodded. My eyes were stinging again, and I let them sting this time, because Frank had seen worse from me, and would see worse again, and we both knew it. There's something else, Frank said, his voice dropping to almost nothing. About Shaw, specifically. Something I found that I wasn't looking for. He held my gaze. I need you to hear this sitting down. I looked at him and felt the bottom of my stomach drop 6 inches. I am sitting down, Frank. He exhaled slowly. I know, He stopped, started again. Give me until tomorrow morning. I need to be certain before I say it out loud. I held his gaze for a long moment. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. Then I gathered the pages, closed the folder, and slid it back across the table. Tomorrow morning, I said. Same place. Frank nodded. His hand reached across and gripped my forearm once briefly firmly, the gesture of a man who has run out of words and is offering what he has left instead. I drove home the long way again. Through the harbor, past the church steeples, past everything ordinary and intact. By the time I turned onto our street, I still didn't know what Frank had found about Shaw. But the dread sitting in my chest told me it was going to change the shape of everything I thought I knew. I had known Elliot Shaw for 11 years. He had monitored my heart through 2 medication adjustments, 1 hospitalization, and the cardiac event in 2022 that kept me in the hospital for 4 days and frightened me in a way I had never entirely admitted to anyone, including myself. He was the kind of doctor who remembered your wife's name and asked about your grandchildren and called you by your first name in a way that felt personal rather than presumptuous. I had trusted him with my life. That phrase had always been figurative. I was beginning to understand it was literal. I was almost home when Frank called. The prepaid buzzed in my jacket pocket, and I pulled over on Trad Street, engine running, watching a woman walk a pair of beagles past the car while I pressed the phone to my ear. I'm ready, Frank said without preamble. Are you somewhere you can talk? Pulled over on Trad. Go ahead. I heard him exhale the long, controlled breath of a man organizing something difficult before he releases it. Shaw has been adjusting your prescriptions 3 times in the past 11 months, George. Each change was small enough to be within normal clinical range. But I had a pharmacist friend look at the sequence, the pattern of changes, the specific drugs involved. She said that taken together over that period, the cumulative effect would be a progressive weakening of cardiac output, fatigue, occasional disorientation, symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped against something it couldn't clear. Consistent with moderate cognitive decline, yes. Frank's voice dropped another register. George, he's been building a paper trail for 6 months. 3 separate evaluation reports, none of them through the hospital system. All filed with a private elder care consultancy in Colombia. The diagnosis listed on each one: progressive cardiac deterioration with early-stage cognitive decline. My hand on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles ached. I've never had a cognitive evaluation. Not with Shaw, not with anyone. I know. A pause. The reports are fabricated, George. He signed them. He dated them. They describe evaluations that never happened in rooms you were never in. The Beagle woman had turned the corner, and the street was empty now, just live oaks and old houses, and the particular quiet of a Charleston afternoon that had no business being this beautiful while this conversation was happening. My eyes were burning so fiercely I had to press the heel of my free hand against them and hold it there. Frank, I said when I could speak again, you said yesterday there was something else, something you needed to be certain about. On the other end of the line, Frank made a sound I had never heard from him before. Something between a breath and a word. Something that belonged to a man standing at the edge of something, and not quite ready to jump. "George, I need you to pull over properly if you're still moving." "I'm parked. Tell me." Another pause. Longer. 14 times, Frank said. "In the past 11 months. The same hotel on Meeting Street, the boutique one near the market. The reservations were made under Shaw's name. The incidental charges went to a credit card." He stopped. "The credit card belongs to Margaret." The street in front of me went blurry. Not because I cried, I didn't cry. Not then. Not in a parked car on Trad Street at 4 in the afternoon. But something happened behind my eyes that made the ordinary world lose its edges for a moment. The live oaks and the old houses going soft and indistinct, while 11 years of trust rearranged itself into something I didn't have a word for yet. 14 times, 11 months, the same hotel. "George." Frank's voice was very careful, very steady, the voice of a man who understood he was holding something that could shatter. "I'm sorry. I needed to be absolutely certain before I told you. I verified it through 2 separate sources." "How long?" I heard myself ask. "Before the hotel records, how long?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I only found the hotel records. I don't know what came before them." I nodded at the windshield. My jaw was clenched so tight I could feel it in my temples. Outside, a cardinal landed on the live oak branch nearest the car, brilliant red against all that gray Spanish moss, and sat there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, then flew away. "Okay," I said. "George." "I heard you, Frank. I'm okay." I wasn't, but that was a problem for later. Right now, I needed to function. "I'll call you tonight." I ended the call. I sat in the parked car for another 3 minutes, with both hands on the wheel, and the engine running, and the afternoon pouring through the windshield. Then I pulled back onto Trad Street and drove the 4 blocks home. Margaret was in the front garden when I pulled into the driveway on her knees, in the flower bed, along the front walk, her old gardening hat on her gloved hands, deep in the soil around the azalea bushes. She looked up when she heard the car, and her whole face lifted into a smile, bright and warm and completely natural. She pulled off one glove and waved at me. I waved back. I made myself smile. I went inside. That evening, she brought me chamomile tea at 8:15 the way she did on nights when she thought I seemed tense. She set it on the corner of my drafting table with a gentle pat on my shoulder and told me not to stay up too late. "You're working too hard," she said fondly. "You're retired, sweetheart. The blueprints will keep." "You're right," I said. "I'll come up soon." She squeezed my shoulder and left. I sat at the drafting table for another 2 minutes after her footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Then I picked up the mug and crossed to the window and poured every drop of that chamomile tea into the soil of the potted ficus in the corner, slowly, completely making sure not a drop remained. Then I sat back down, put the empty mug on the corner of the desk where she'd left it, and looked at the ficus. It was already looking, I noticed, slightly unwell. I thought about Elliot Shaw and his careful handshakes, and the way he always remembered to ask about Margaret's garden. I thought about 14 hotel reservations on a credit card I had never known existed. I thought about my son's $1.5 million debt and the $3.2 million insurance policy that would resolve it in the event of my death, and the forged signature that had made it possible, and the fabricated medical records that would explain why I had declined so rapidly. I thought about 38 years, and then I thought about Thursday evening, when Nathan and Claire were coming for dinner, our daughter-in-law Claire, who had always been the sharper of the two, who watched rooms the way architects watched buildings, who I had always liked and never entirely understood. I thought it was past time I started paying closer attention to Claire. Nathan arrived the way he always arrived, loud and easy, filling the front hallway with his voice before he was fully through the door. "Dad, something smells incredible in here." He came in grinning, arms wide, and pulled me into a hug that lasted exactly 1 second longer than his usual hugs, the kind of length that belongs to a man compensating for something. I hugged him back and felt the tension in his shoulders coiled tight under his jacket. And I thought, my boy, my poor, terrified boy. "Pot roast from last night?" Margaret called from the kitchen. "Reheated. Claire, come in, let me take your coat." Claire stepped through the door behind Nathan and smiled at me, that particular smile of hers, precise and warm, in exactly the right measure, like something calibrated rather than felt. She was 37 years old and had the kind of face that gave nothing away unless you knew what you were looking for. I had always admired her for it. That Thursday evening I was looking for everything. "George," she kissed my cheek. Her perfume was light, expensive. "You look well. How's the knee?" "Complaining as usual," I said, stepping back to let them in. "Come sit down." Margaret made her good cornbread. We settled into the dining room the way we always did on Thursday evenings, Nathan and Claire across from Margaret and me, the good china out, candles lit. To anyone watching from outside the window, it would have looked like the most ordinary family dinner in the world. I had sat at this table 10,000 times, and never once felt like I was behind glass, looking in at someone else's life. That evening, I felt it with every breath. Nathan talked. That was what Nathan did when he was nervous. He talked, filling silence the way water fills a container, taking the shape of whatever space was available. He talked about a project at work, about a restaurant in downtown Charleston he and Claire had tried, about whether the Braves were going to have a decent season. His voice was confident and easy, and his eyes, when I caught them, were doing something entirely different from his mouth. They were watchful. They were calculating distances. I watched Claire. She ate neatly, asked Margaret about the garden, laughed at exactly the right moments in Nathan's stories. But her eyes were moving. Not obviously, you would never notice if you weren't specifically watching for it, but steadily, methodically, the way a surveyor's eyes move across a site. The smoke detector above the sideboard. The angle of the hallway from the dining room. The cardiac monitor clipped to my shirt. She looked at each thing for exactly the amount of time required, and then moved on, and the whole sequence took perhaps 40 seconds. And then she was laughing at something Nathan had said and refilling her water glass, and it was as if it had never happened. Halfway through the main course, I set down my fork and coughed. Not dramatically, just a dry, rough cough, the kind a man makes when something has gone down wrong. I pressed my fist to my mouth and coughed twice more, then reached for my water. Nathan stopped talking mid-sentence. Margaret was on her feet before the second cough hand on my arm. "George, are you all right? Should I get your—" I'm fine. I waved her off gently. "Water went down wrong. Sit down, sweetheart." She sat, but her hand stayed on my arm for another moment, hovering ready. I glanced at Claire. She had looked at her watch. It was a gesture so small and so quick that anyone else at that table would have missed it completely. A reflex, almost automatic, like a person checking the time when they hear a sound they've been waiting for. She caught herself immediately and picked up her fork, but the moment had already happened, and I had seen it, and I filed it in the part of my mind that retained the measurements other people considered insignificant. After dinner, Nathan and Margaret moved to the kitchen to deal with the dishes. Nathan had always been the one who insisted on helping clean up, one of the genuinely good things about him that I held on to in those weeks like a lifeline. Claire and I stayed in the living room with our coffee, and for a few minutes we talked about the renovation she and Nathan were considering for their house on Rutledge Avenue, about a book she was reading, about nothing in particular. Then she stood to refill her coffee from the carafe on the side table. She moved across the living room with her cup in her hand, unhurried and natural, the way a woman moves through a room she knows well. As she passed the television console, she reached out with her free hand almost casually, almost incidentally, and her fingers moved along the back of the unit for just a moment. A touch. A check. 2 seconds, maybe 3. My chest tightened so sharply I had to breathe through it. I kept my face completely neutral. I was looking at the artwork on the far wall when she turned back around, and I kept my eyes there for another half second before I looked at her and I said, "That book sounds interesting. What did you say the author's name was?" She sat back down and told me, and we talked for another 20 minutes, until Nathan reappeared from the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel, and announcing cheerfully that Margaret was winning the argument about where the good casserole dish belonged, and I laughed and said she'd been winning that argument since 1989. They left at 9:30. I stood on the front porch and waved until their taillights turned the corner. Then I went back inside and found Margaret in the kitchen finishing the counters, and I kissed her on the top of her head and told her dinner had been wonderful, and she glowed the way she always did when the family had been together. "It's good to see Nathan," she said softly, folding the dish towel. "He seems better lately, don't you think?" "I think so," I said. I went to my study. I waited 20 minutes until I heard Margaret's footsteps going upstairs and the bedroom door close. Then I took a flashlight from the desk drawer and went down the hall to the guest room. The smoke detector on the ceiling was the same model as the one in my study. The newer housing, the slightly different profile. Fresh, clean. Not a mark on the ceiling around it, which meant it had been installed recently and carefully by someone who knew what they were doing and had done it before. Claire had installed it tonight, during dinner or before when she and Nathan arrived early, and Margaret had taken Claire's coat, and the two women had gone upstairs for a few minutes to, as Margaret put it, see the new curtains in the guest room. I stood in the guest room, with my flashlight off, and the dark around me, and my heart hammering against my ribs, and I thought about the way Claire's eyes had moved around the dining room. Methodical. Systematic. The eyes of someone building a record, not committing a crime of passion. Margaret was desperate. Nathan was drowning. Claire was something else entirely. And whatever Claire was building, whatever record she was making of the things that happened in this house, I had a feeling it was not entirely for the same reasons that Margaret and Nathan were making theirs. I had an appointment with Dr. Elliot Shaw that Friday morning that Margaret had scheduled 3 weeks earlier, back when the world was still the world I thought I lived in. I kept it. A man who cancels his cardiologist appointment raises questions. A man who sits in the waiting room with a magazine he doesn't read. Who answers the intake nurse's questions about his sleep and his appetite and his stress levels with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this for 11 years. Gives nothing away. I had spent my career building things that needed to appear stronger than they were. This was just another structure. "You don't have to come in," I told Margaret at the front door, reaching for my jacket. "I can drive myself. It's just the regular check." She already had her purse. "Don't be silly. I like to hear what Shaw says directly. You always leave out the parts that worry me." She said it with a smile fond and gently exasperated, the smile of a wife who knows her husband too well. My throat tightened, but I kept my face easy. "Fair enough," I said. "Let's go." She talked on the drive over about Eleanor Harris's garden club drama, about whether the azaleas needed feeding before the heat came in, and I drove and nodded and made the right sounds, and by the time we pulled into Shaw's parking lot on Ashley Avenue, I had convinced myself I was ready for this. I was not ready for this. Shaw came out of his office to greet me personally, the way he always did. That was one of his gifts. The personal touch that made you feel like you were his only patient rather than one of 30. He extended his hand and smiled that warm, confident smile and I shook his hand and smiled back, and the whole thing lasted 4 seconds and felt like 4 years. His palm was dry. I noted that. Whatever Shaw was feeling about this appointment, he was better at hiding it than I expected. "George, good to see you." He gestured toward the exam room. "Come on back. Margaret, you're welcome to wait in my office if you'd like more comfortable than the waiting room." "That would be lovely," Margaret said, already moving in that direction, as if she'd been there before. She had been there before I realized. Of course she had. Shaw closed the exam room door and ran through the routine the way he had 100 times blood pressure cuff. The small pen light he used to check my pupils. The stethoscope pressed cold against my chest while he listened with his eyes closed and his face professionally still. I sat on the exam table in my undershirt and let him work, and watched his face with the particular attention of a man who now understood exactly what was behind it. He was good. I had to give him that. His hands were steady, his movements efficient, his expression revealing nothing more than clinical focus. But there were tells, small ones, the kind you only catch when you know what you're watching for. He looked at my chart more than he needed to. He asked me to repeat answers I had already given clearly, and twice when I shifted slightly on the exam table, his eyes went to my face with a speed that had nothing to do with medical attention and everything to do with assessment. He was watching to see how far along I was. "How have you been feeling this week?" he asked, making notes. "Energy levels, any episodes of confusion or disorientation?" "Some fatigue," I said. I let my voice come out slightly slower than usual, slightly more effortful. "I forgot where I put my reading glasses yesterday. Had to look for 20 minutes. Shaw wrote something down without looking up. "That's not uncommon with your condition. The medications can affect short-term memory retrieval." He paused, pen moving. "Anything else?" "I called Nathan by the wrong name at dinner last night," I said. Just for a moment, I corrected myself. Shaw set the pen down. He looked at me, then really looked for the first time since I'd sat down. And in his eyes I saw the thing Frank had warned me about, not concern, not guilt, but calculation. The rapid, practiced assessment of a man running numbers. "George," he said, and his voice had gone carefully, professionally gentle. "I want to be honest with you. What you're describing, the fatigue, the memory lapses, these are consistent with the progression I've been noting in your last few evaluations." My jaw ached from the effort of not responding to that. My last few evaluations, the ones that had never happened, the ones he had written in a private elder care consultancy in Colombia while I was at home eating Margaret's pot roast and believing I was a healthy man. "Am I getting worse, Elliot?" I asked. I used his first name the way I always had, the way old patients use their doctor's first names, familiarity, trust, the comfortable shorthand of 11 years. He paused. 1 second. 2. A fraction too long for a man who should have had the answer ready. "We're managing it, George," he said finally. "That's what we do, we manage it." He adjusted my prescriptions before I left, increased the beta blocker by 25 milligrams, reduced the antiarrhythmic. I watched him write the new orders, and I nodded at everything he said, and I thanked him when he handed me the printed prescription summary, and when he extended his hand at the door of the exam room, I shook it again. This time his palm was not dry. The cold clamminess of it lasted in my hand all the way down the hall, past the framed diplomas and the cheerful watercolor prints that had always seemed so reassuringly ordinary through the waiting room, where Margaret stood up immediately when she saw me with that bright, ready attention she'd been giving me for weeks. "How did it go?" she asked, taking my arm. "Shaw wants me to rest more," I said. "Reduce my stress." He adjusted the dosage on a couple things. Her hand tightened on my arm just slightly, just for half a second. "That makes sense," she said warmly. You've been pushing yourself too hard. We'll take it easy this weekend. That sounds good, I said. In the pocket of my vest, 2 of the new prescription pills were folded inside a small square of paper, the kind of paper that comes wrapped around a piece of hard candy, which I had found in my jacket pocket and repurposed while Shaw was writing his notes and not watching my hands. I had palmed them from the sample pack he handed me with the practiced smoothness of a man who had spent 40 years making precise movements in small spaces. Frank was driving them to a private toxicology laboratory in Columbia that afternoon. The lab handled independent pharmaceutical testing for attorneys and insurance companies. No doctor's referral required results in 72 hours. We would have the results on Monday. Whatever those results said, I already knew what they meant. I had known since Frank's pharmacist friend had walked him through the prescription sequence on Wednesday. I just needed the paper. I needed the number. I needed the kind of evidence that doesn't require anyone to take a 68-year-old man's word for it. Margaret squeezed my arm as we walked to the car, tucking herself close to my side, the way she had on 1,000 cold mornings and warm ones. I worry about you, she said softly. I know you do, I said. 72 hours. Whatever was in those pills, it would have a name by Monday. And a name was the beginning of everything. The lab results came in on Sunday afternoon. I was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace in the living room, a book open in my lap that I had not read a single word of since Friday, when the prepaid phone in my cardigan pocket buzzed once. I kept my face pointed at the page. Margaret was in the kitchen. I could hear the particular rhythm of her moving around in their cabinet doors, the tap running the small sounds of a Sunday afternoon. I slid the phone out just far enough to read the screen. Frank. 2 words. Not yours. 2 words that confirmed everything and made it impossible to unknow. I put the phone back in my pocket and turned a page of the book. I wasn't reading, and breathed through the thing that moved through my chest, not grief exactly, not rage exactly, something older and heavier that lived underneath both of them. Not yours. The pills I had swallowed every morning for 6 years, trusting them to keep my heart in rhythm, to keep me upright and functional and alive. For how long had they been something else entirely? Weeks, months. How many mornings had I reached into that organizer, with Margaret's neat handwriting on every compartment, and taken something designed not to help me, but to hollow me out slowly and carefully, and without leaving marks, I turned another page. Nathan and Claire arrived at 4 o'clock. Nathan brought beer he didn't end up drinking, and Claire brought flowers she arranged in the kitchen vase, with the particular efficiency of a woman doing something out of habit rather than affection. We sat in the living room and talked about things that didn't matter, a movie they'd seen, the traffic on I-26, whether the weather was going to cooperate for the outdoor art festival on Marion Square next weekend. By 6 o'clock, I let my eyelids grow heavy. It wasn't difficult. 68 years old, a compromised heart, a week that had aged me a decade. The exhaustion I performed for the camera above the fireplace mantel was not entirely a performance. I let my head tip back against the chair cushion. I let my breathing slow and deepen. I let the book slide sideways in my lap and didn't reach for it. Across the room, Nathan's voice dropped half a register, the way voices do when the speaker believes the room has changed. He's out, Nathan said quietly. I heard Margaret set something down in the kitchen. Then footsteps, not toward me, but toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen door that led to the rear porch. Claire's lighter step, then Nathan's, then the soft sound of the screen door. I gave them 90 seconds. Then I opened my eyes. The living room was empty. Through the window to my left, the one Margaret had cracked open 2 inches that afternoon, to let in the mild spring air, their voices drifted back to me low and quick, and completely unguarded. It was Margaret's voice I heard first, precise and controlled the way it always was when she was managing something. Shaw says 2 more months, maybe less if we're consistent with the salt. My hand gripped the armchair so hard the fabric bunched under my fingers. Nathan's voice rougher. The facility in Savannah has a room available starting May 1st. I already called them. Good. Margaret brisk, businesslike. The voice she used when she was running a list. What about the paperwork? He hasn't signed the power of attorney yet. He will. Claire's voice cool and measured, the steadiest of the three. Shaw is adjusting the dosage again next week. After that, he won't have the clarity to push back. We give it 10 days. A pause. Then Nathan lower. And if he notices something's different with the new dosage, he won't. Margaret flat and certain. He's already losing track of days. Did you see him at dinner Thursday? He called you Derek. I had called Nathan by the right name at every meal for 40 years. My chest cracked open at those words, not with anger, but with something so much worse than anger. The recognition that she had been rehearsing this story, polishing it, preparing it for an audience that wasn't me. After the paperwork, Nathan said, how long before? Don't. Margaret's voice sharp. Don't ask me that. Just handle your part. The screen door opened, and I was back in my chair before it closed, head tipped back, breathing slow, the book still sideways in my lap. They came back into the living room, and Nathan turned on the television, and Margaret made decaf coffee, and the evening resumed, as if the rear porch had never happened, and those words had never been said. I surfaced gradually, blinking the way a man surfaces from a nap, and I said something vague about the news program, and Margaret patted my hand and said I should get to bed early. Nathan and Claire left at 8:30. I walked them to the door and shook Nathan's hand and told Claire the flowers were beautiful, and I meant it. And I watched their car back out of the driveway and turn down the street. Then I went back to my armchair. Margaret was in the kitchen finishing the coffee cups. I could hear the water running. I sat in the chair where I had just played the role of a man losing his grip on the world, and I looked at the fireplace and I felt the weight of 2 more months, and the facility in Savannah settle into my bones like something permanent. May 1st. They had a room. They had a date. They had a doctor adjusting my dosage in 10 days to make sure I wouldn't have the clarity to push back. I pulled out the prepaid phone and typed to Frank with both thumbs fast and precise. It's accelerating. They have a timeline. May 1st. I need crews, and I need to start performing for real. Frank's response came in under a minute. I'll call her tonight. Start tomorrow. Are you ready? I looked at the living room around me, the house I had drawn on paper in 1992 and built with my own hands. In 1994, the fireplace I had specified in the original plans, the armchair I had been sitting in for 20 years. The camera above the mantel blinked its steady blink. I typed back, I've been ready since Monday. The most difficult thing I have ever done in 68 years of living was not designing a building, or burying my parents, or sitting in a hospital bed in 2022, wondering if my heart was going to remember how to beat correctly. It was sitting at my own breakfast table on a Monday morning in April and pretending not to know what a coffee maker was. George, Margaret's voice gentle and worried exactly as she intended it. Honey, it's right there, on the counter, where it's always been. I looked at the coffee maker with carefully manufactured confusion, brow furrowed, eyes slightly unfocused, the expression of a man reaching for something that keeps moving. I know I shook my head slowly. I forgot what you call it. For a moment. Her hand came to my shoulder, immediately warm and concerned and devastating. It's okay, she said softly. It happens. It happened 3 more times that morning. I asked her what day it was, then asked again 20 minutes later. I stood in the doorway of the study for a full 10 seconds, looking at my own drafting table as if I didn't recognize it. I called the oak tree in the front yard, that big one, because I told her the name had slipped away from me. Each time Margaret wrote something in the small notebook on the kitchen counter. She thought I didn't see it. I saw it every single time. By Wednesday, I had told Frank I was ready, and Frank had arranged the meeting. Detective Lena Cruz was 41 years old, compact and sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that assessed everything in the first 30 seconds and revealed nothing about what it had assessed. She ran the Elder Financial Abuse Unit at the Charleston Police Department and had a standing partnership with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Frank had worked with her twice during his career and trusted her the way retired professionals trust the colleagues who never cut corners. She was waiting in Frank's home office when I arrived, and she stood when I came in and extended her hand with the directness of someone who had no time for preliminaries. "Mr. Calloway." Her grip was firm and brief. "Frank has given me the overview. I need to hear it from you," so I told her. All of it. The pills, the camera. Thomas Reed's warning, the lab results. Frank's financial investigation, Shaw's fabricated evaluations. The conversation on the rear porch Sunday evening. I spoke for 22 minutes without stopping, and when I finished, Cruz sat with her pen touching her notepad, but not moving, and I watched her think. "This is strong," she said, finally looking up. "The toxicology results alone are significant. But George," she leaned forward, "what I need to bring charges that will stick is something more than evidence gathered privately. I need them to say it. I need the fraud to be committed in a way we can document officially." Her dark eyes held mine steadily. "That means we let this play out far enough for them to make their move. They need to believe they've already won." My jaw tightened. "How far? Far enough that someone puts a document in front of you and asks you to sign it. Far enough that Shaw submits his evaluation to a court for a guardianship proceeding, or that Margaret initiates a formal power of attorney transfer." She paused. "Can you keep performing?" "I've been performing for 38 years, I said. "Another few weeks won't break me." Something shifted in Cruz's expression, not quite admiration, but the thing adjacent to it. The thing that looks like respect when a person has earned it the hard way. "Then here's what we do. You continue. I position my team to move the moment the attempt is formalized. And George," she tapped the notepad once, "you do not tip your hand. Not to Margaret, not to Nathan, not to anyone outside this room and Frank." "Understood," I said. Frank walked me out to my car afterward and gripped my forearm in the parking lot. His eyes were red at the edges in the afternoon light, and he didn't try to hide it, which told me more about how frightened he had been for me than anything he could have said. "You're doing the right thing," he said, his voice rough. "I know," I said. "It doesn't make it easier." The following Thursday, I sat across from a man named Richard Carver in a downtown law office on Broad Street, and I signed the documents that transferred the bulk of my assets, the house, the investment accounts, the architectural rights, into an irrevocable trust. Richard had been my attorney for 19 years, since before Nathan graduated high school, and he moved through the paperwork with the focused efficiency of someone who understood the urgency without needing it, explained twice. When the last signature was dry, he looked across the desk at me and said, "George, this is done. Whatever they bring you to sign from here on, it won't matter. There's nothing left to take." My eyes burned so fiercely and so suddenly that I had to press 2 fingers to the bridge of my nose and hold them there. 19 years of professional relationship, and Richard had never once seen me come close to tears in his office. "Thank you," I said, when I could say it without my voice breaking in half. He walked me out. I stood on Broad Street in the April afternoon and breathed the salt air off the harbor and thought about the house I had just protected and the woman who had been trying to take it from me and the 38 years that lived in the space between those two facts. That Friday evening, Margaret came to find me in the study with the careful expression she had been wearing more often lately, the one that looked like tenderness but measured everything. "Shaw called this afternoon," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "He wants to see you again next week instead of the 15th. He says he'd like to check in sooner given—" she paused, "given how things have been going." "Whatever he thinks is best," I said, looking up from the project manual I wasn't reading. She smiled at me, warm, attentive, devoted, and went back down the hall. I waited until her footsteps reached the kitchen. Then I turned back to the manual and stared at the page without seeing it, and in the back of my mind, quiet and precise as a calculation, running in the background, I thought about Cruz's words. They need to believe they've already won. Later that evening, I heard Margaret on the rear porch, again, her voice low and quick, the particular register of someone reporting progress to someone who needed to hear it. I couldn't make out the words from the study. I didn't need to. Whoever was on the other end of that call, they were about to be very wrong about who was winning. I had kept a floor safe in my study since 1997. It was built into the wall behind the large architectural drawing of the Callaway house, my house, the one I had sketched in pencil on a yellow legal pad on a Tuesday evening in 1992 and turned into something real by 1994. The safe required both a combination and a physical key, and I had changed the combination. 3 show. After the locksmith came to service it, and I had not told Margaret the new one. Not out of suspicion, not then. Simply because there had been no reason to tell her, and some habits of privacy survive 38 years of marriage without meaning anything in particular, until they mean everything. I went to my study at 11 o'clock the way I always did on restless nights, and I stood in front of the architectural drawing for a moment before I pulled it aside. The first thing I saw were the scratches. They were fine, barely visible in the lamplight, the kind of marks that required you to know what you were looking for before you could find them. Around the dial, 3 small lines that hadn't been there the last time I'd opened this safe. Around the keyhole, a series of micro-scratches in the brass plate, the kind left by the tip of a pick tool when someone is working fast and trying to be careful and not quite managing both at once. My stomach dropped so hard, I actually put one hand on the wall beside the safe to steady myself. Someone had been in here. I worked through the combination with hands that refused to be still, the dial slipping twice because my fingers were shaking. Actually shaking the way they had not shaken since the night I called Frank on the prepaid phone. The key turned. The door swung open. The files were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, nothing thrown around, nothing obviously missing. But I had spent 40 years organizing documents for a living, and I knew the precise order of every paper in that safe, the way I knew the load calculations on every building I had ever designed. The Callaway property deed was on top where it always was. The tax documents were behind it. But the space between the tax documents and the estate planning folder was a centimeter too wide, and the estate planning folder itself was facing a 1/4 inch to the left of where it should have been. Someone had gone through this carefully, deliberately, and put everything back almost right. I reached in and took out the estate planning folder, opened it, lifted out the document on top, the one in the clear protective sleeve, the one labeled Last Will and Testament of George Arthur Callaway, in Richard Carver's firm's header. I looked at it for a moment, and then for the first time in several weeks, I smiled. What they had taken, what they believed they had taken, was a document I had placed in this safe 23 days ago, the morning after my first meeting with Cruz. It was a photocopy of my previous will modified in 2 places, printed on aged paper, and inserted into an authentic-looking sleeve from Richard's office. The real will, updated and executed, was locked in Richard Carver's office on Broad Street, where it had been since the day I signed the trust documents. Cruz had been the one who suggested it, actually. "Give them something to find," she had said. "Let them think they've pulled the thread. People who believe they have the advantage stop looking for the trap." I slid the document back into the sleeve, placed it back in the folder, closed the safe and spun the dial and pulled the architectural drawing back into place over the wall until it hung exactly as it had hung for 20 years. Then I crossed to my drafting chair and sat down and pressed both palms flat on the surface of the table and looked at the bookshelves across the room. 40 years of project files, the accumulated documentation of a career spent building things that were meant to outlast the people who built them. And I felt the grief of it roll through me in a long, slow wave. 38 years. She had hired someone to pick the lock on my safe, or paid someone, or asked Nathan, who was desperate enough by now to do things he would never have imagined doing 10 years ago. Someone had stood in my study, in the room where I had spent the best hours of my professional life, surrounded by the work that had defined me, and had gone through my private documents with gloved hands and a set of lockpicks, looking for the means to take everything I had built. My eyes burned so badly, I had to tip my head back and stare at the ceiling until the feeling passed. I would not cry in this room. Not here. Not for this. I pulled the prepaid phone from my cardigan pocket. There was a message from Frank sent at 9:47 that evening. I had missed it while I was still performing uselessness for the camera above the drafting table, turning pages I wasn't reading, pausing to stare at nothing, the way a confused man stares at nothing. "George, I need to talk to you tomorrow morning. About Nathan. I've been sitting on something for 2 weeks, and I can't sit on it any longer. Call me when you're up." I read the message twice. Then I set the phone face down on the drafting table and looked at the ceiling again. Frank had been sitting on something for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, which meant he had known it before the Sunday evening on the rear porch, before the lab results, before my meeting with Cruz, before I signed the trust documents. He had known something about Nathan for 2 weeks, and had chosen with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood exactly what he was withholding and why not to tell me yet. In 41 years of friendship, Frank had only ever done that once before. The night of my father's funeral, when he had known for 3 days that my brother had borrowed money from the estate without telling anyone, and had waited until I was steadier before he said it. "He waited until you could hear it," Frank had told me afterward. "That's not the same as hiding it. That's just timing." I sat at the drafting table in the lamplight, and I thought about Nathan, 40 years old, my son, the boy who had hugged me at his college graduation, after shaking my hand with great ceremony, because he'd decided that was what men did. The boy who had been afraid of thunderstorms until he was 9 years old. The boy whose photograph I still kept in my wallet, 8 years old, gap-toothed, holding up a catfish at the lake near my sister's place in Asheville, like it was the greatest achievement of his short life. I thought about what Frank might have found that he had been carrying for 2 weeks. My hand went to my chest without thinking, not to the cardiac monitor, but to the space beneath it, the actual physical place where the thing that was hurting me lived. Whatever it was, I was going to hear it tomorrow morning. I turned off the desk lamp. I sat in the dark for a while, listening to the house settle around me. The refrigerator hum, the tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. Then I got up and went to bed, and I lay in the dark beside my wife of 38 years, and I stared at the ceiling, and I waited for morning. Before I reveal the cruelest truth that my close friend Frank Dalton held back for 2 weeks, leave a "still here" in the comments, so I know you're still tracking this journey for justice. And please note, The upcoming events contain highly dramatized elements for suspense and may not fully mirror reality. If you prefer not to listen to these dark twists, you can turn off the video right now. Frank arrived at 9:15, exactly when I'd asked him to. I heard his car in the driveway and opened the front door before he reached the porch steps. He was carrying 2 coffees from the place on King Street, the good ones, not the gas station kind, and he held one out to me without saying anything, and I took it, and we went to the kitchen the way we had gone to kitchens together for 41 years. Margaret had left for the Harris Teeter on Rutledge at 8:50, the way she left every Wednesday, without fail. Groceries Garden Center. If something caught her eye, occasionally a stop at the dry cleaners on the way back. An hour and 40 minutes minimum. We had exactly that long. Frank set his coffee on the table and sat down. He placed a folder in front of him, thin, maybe 4 pages inside, and he put both hands flat on top of it and looked at me with the expression I had only seen on his face one time before in 4 decades of friendship. The night of my father's funeral. The night he'd been holding something for 3 days and could not hold it any longer. "Frank," I said, sitting down across from him, "whatever it is, I need you to say it." He looked at me for a long moment, really looked the way a man looks at someone he loves before he does something he knows is going to hurt them. Then he said, "I need you to tell me when you're ready." "I'm ready," I said. "Open it." He opened the folder and turned it to face me. The document on top was a single page. A laboratory report, the kind with the official header, the reference numbers, the clinical language that strips human devastation down to columns and percentages. At the top, paternity analysis report. Below it, 2 sample identifications. Sample A, George Arthur Calloway, sourced from medical records, Charleston Medical Center, cardiac event admission, 2022. Sample B, Nathan James, Calloway, sourced from hair follicle, collected April 2025. At the bottom of the page, in the flat, indifferent font of scientific certainty, probability of paternity 0.00%. The kitchen went very quiet. Not because either of us stopped moving. Frank's hands were still flat on the table. I was still holding my coffee, but because the sound the world was making suddenly had nothing to do with anything in the room, and the room itself felt very far away, I set the coffee cup down. Carefully. The way you set something down when your hands have gone cold and you're not entirely sure they're going to cooperate. "George," Frank started, "how did you get the sample?" My voice came out lower than I intended, scraped against something at the bottom of my throat. The laughter in his voice last Thursday at dinner. Frank's own voice was rough, careful. When he went to the guest bathroom to wash his hands before dessert, I went in after him. There was a comb on the counter, one of those black ones, the kind you carry in a jacket pocket. He paused. "Your medical DNA was already on file from the cardiac admission 3 years ago. You signed a release when you authorized me to review your records last month." I nodded. I remembered signing it. I had not known at the time what Frank intended to cross-reference it against. I pushed my chair back and stood up and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, Margaret's garden ran along the back fence the way it always had. The azaleas she'd been tending since '98. The wisteria, the tomatoes she started from seed, every March in little plastic cups on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. She had grown those tomatoes from seed in this kitchen for 26 years. I stood at the window and looked at her garden, and I did the math that I had been refusing to do since Frank first mentioned Shaw's hotel records in April. Nathan was born in 1985. Shaw had been our family physician since 1992, but hotel records only went back 11 months. 11 months was what Frank could prove. 11 months was not the beginning. "Frank," my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "How far back does it go with Shaw and Margaret? Your best estimate." Frank exhaled slowly. I don't know, George. Honestly, the hotel records are 11 months. Before that, he stopped. I looked. I couldn't find anything earlier that I could verify. I kept looking at the garden, the wisteria on the back wall, 15 years of patient, careful training winding itself around the structure I had built until you couldn't separate one from the other. 40 years. I had been his father for 40 years. I had caught him when he fell off his bicycle on a Sunday afternoon in 1992. I had sat up with him through a fever that scared us both when he was 6. I had driven him to his first job interview and waited in the parking lot and felt my heart slam against my ribs when he came out grinning. I had done 10,000 things that fathers do without thinking, because they are simply what fathers do without once suspecting that the biology underneath it was something other than what I believed. My eyes were burning so fiercely that the garden blurred at the edges. I pressed 2 fingers hard against my eyelids and held them there, breathing through my nose, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, until the burning receded to something manageable. Then I turned around. Frank was watching me from the table, with his hands still flat on the folder, and his jaw tight, and his eyes red at the corners, and I could see the effort it cost him to stay in his seat, the 41-year instinct to stand up and put his hand on my shoulder, held in check by his understanding that right now, what I needed was not comfort, but space to get my footing back. I loved him for that. I loved him for knowing the difference. Does this change the plan? I asked. Frank's jaw worked for a moment. His voice when it came was rough and certain. No, it makes it more important. I nodded, pulled my chair back out, sat down, picked up my coffee and drank what was left of it, even though it had gone cold because my hands needed something to do and my body needed to keep moving. Then we continue, I said. Frank reached across the table and gripped my forearm with both hands, hard, the way you grip something you don't want to let go. His hands were shaking slightly. Frank Dalton, who I had never seen shake, whose steadiness I had relied on through 4 decades of difficulty, and that small tremor undid something in me that I immediately had to put back together. George, he said, and his voice broke in the middle of my name. Just slightly. Just enough. I'm so sorry. I know, I said. Keep going anyway. He nodded. Let go. Sat back. We talked for 20 more minutes, logistics, cruise's timeline, the next steps Frank needed to take. Practical things. Necessary things. The kind of conversation that keeps a man moving when standing still would be the end of him. He left at 10:40. I stood at the front door and watched his car pull away, and then went back to the kitchen and washed both coffee cups and put them in the drying rack. At 10:58, I heard Margaret's car in the driveway. I dried my hands on the dish towel and went to the front hall and opened the door before she reached it, and I took 2 of the grocery bags from her arms, and I asked if they'd had the good strawberries at Harris Teeter this week, and she laughed and said yes, and I should see the size of them. I carried the bags to the kitchen. I helped her put the groceries away. I asked about the azaleas. I smiled at exactly the right moments, and not once, not for a single second, did I let her see that the man standing next to her in her own kitchen was someone she did not know at all. There is a particular kind of dinner table that looks like family and feels like theater. That Friday evening in late April, with the good china out, and the candles lit, and the 4 of us arranged around the dining room table the way we had arranged ourselves 100 times before, I understood for the first time what it felt like to be the only person in the room who had read the script. Nathan arrived that evening with a bottle of wine he'd picked out carefully. I could tell by the label, a Napa Valley Cabernet from a vineyard we'd visited together. In 2019, the kind of choice a man makes when he's trying to say something he doesn't have words for. He hugged me at the door the way he had that first Thursday, 1 second too long, and I hugged him back and felt the tremor in his shoulders that he was working very hard to suppress. "You look good, Dad," he said, pulling back. His eyes moved over my face with an assessment so quick it was almost invisible. Almost. "I feel all right today," I said with the slight, vague smile I had been practicing for 3 weeks. "Some days are better." Something moved through his expression, relief, and behind it, twisting through it like a dark thread, something that looked painfully like shame. He looked away toward the dining room, and I let him, and I said nothing, because there was nothing I could say yet. I watched Claire through the entire meal. She was quieter than usual, not withdrawn, not unfriendly, but operating at a lower frequency than her normal, careful warmth. She asked Margaret about the garden, complimented the roast chicken, laughed at Nathan's story, about a client meeting that had gone sideways. But her eyes kept returning to Margaret with a regularity that had nothing to do with conversation. She was watching Margaret the way I had been watching all of them for the past 6 weeks, taking inventory, measuring, filing things away. Midway through the main course, I set my fork down and stared at the empty space above the centerpiece candle for a long moment, the way a man stares when a thought has slipped its leash. "George," Margaret's hand on my arm immediately warm with practiced concern. "Honey, are you with us?" "Yes." I blinked and refocused and smiled at her the way confused men smile when they're embarrassed by their own confusion. "Sorry, I was thinking about something, and then I lost it." Nathan's fork paused above his plate. Claire looked at her wineglass and took a careful sip. "It's all right," Margaret said, gently squeezing my arm. "It happens." After dinner, Nathan announced he was going out to the back porch for some air, a detail that surprised me because in 40 years, I had never once seen my son smoke a cigarette. But the particular way he said air, and the way Claire's eyes went to him briefly, and then away again, told me this was not new information to her. There were things my son was hiding from me that his wife had long since stopped pretending not to know about. I excused myself shortly after. "Tired, I think I'll read for a bit," and moved down the hall toward the study. I did not go into the study. I stood just inside the doorway in the shadow, where the hall light didn't reach, and I looked back through the gap between the door and the frame at the living room, where Margaret and Claire had settled on opposite ends of the sofa with their after-dinner coffee. Margaret was talking something about a schedule about Shaw, about how much more settled things would feel once the paperwork was in order by late May. Her voice was confident, organized, the voice of a woman who had run a complex plan for 14 months and could see the finish line from where she was standing. And then Claire reached forward and set her phone on the coffee table. Face down. Screen dark. Except not entirely dark. In the corner of the phone's casing, a small indicator light, barely 3 millimeters, the kind you miss unless you're looking, glowed a steady faint red. Recording. My chest contracted so sharply, I had to press my shoulder blade against the doorframe to keep myself upright. South Carolina, I knew from a conversation with Frank weeks ago, was a one-party consent state. One person in the conversation had to know they were being recorded. Claire was in the conversation. What Claire was doing was completely legal, which meant she had thought about it enough to know that. Margaret, still talking, didn't notice the phone. Why would she, Claire, had set it face down the way people set phones, face down all the time, reaching for their coffee, giving their full attention to the conversation. Nothing remarkable about it. "After everything is transferred," Margaret said, her voice dropping into the lower register she used for logistics. "I'm thinking we handle Savannah by July at the latest. Elliot agrees the timeline is realistic." Claire nodded slowly. "And the split you mentioned, splitting the liquid assets. How does that actually work between the three of us?" Margaret gave a number. I watched Claire's face receive it. It was a masterclass. In controlled reaction, Claire's expression didn't flicker, didn't tighten, didn't show the faintest trace of the calculation happening behind it. But I had spent 40 years reading structural stress in materials that looked perfectly sound from the outside, and I saw it. A micro-tension around the jaw. A blink that lasted a half-second too long. The faintest tightening at the corner of her mouth that belonged not to acceptance but to assessment. Claire was not satisfied with the number. And Claire, I understood in that moment, was not going to remain satisfied with whatever Margaret had decided she deserved. Nathan came back in from the porch a few minutes later, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and fresh air. And the evening resumed its ordinary shape, dishes, cleared jackets, retrieved the warm ritual of a family, saying goodnight on a front porch in April. I shook Nathan's hand at the door. He held on a fraction of a second longer than a handshake requires. I watched their taillights disappear around the corner. Then I went to the back garden, where there were no cameras, and I sat in the iron chair by the rose bed, and I breathed the night air, and I thought about a small red light on the underside of a phone. The fracture was there, running right through the center of what they had built together. And fractures, in my experience, have a way of spreading exactly when the structure is under the most load. The morning I staged my own heart attack, I woke at 5 o'clock and lay in the dark for 20 minutes running through the sequence. Not out of anxiety, I had moved past anxiety somewhere around week 3 of performing confusion at my own breakfast table. This was something colder and more methodical. The way I used to lie in bed the morning of a major construction inspection, walking every floor plan in my head, before I walked it in reality, identifying every place where something might not hold. The difference was that this time I was the structure being inspected. I had talked it through with crews 2 weeks earlier. The parameters, the limits, what I could safely perform without triggering a genuine medical event. I had also, without telling Margaret, established care with a new cardiologist at MUSC, Dr. Patricia Hale, who knew my actual chart and had given me a clear picture of what my heart could and could not tolerate. The symptoms I was going to perform that morning were real symptoms, the kind my heart had produced in genuine emergencies. The difference was that this time I would stop before they became one. By 6:15, I was dressed and downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, doing what a man with declining cognition does in the morning, moving slowly, looking slightly lost in a familiar space, letting Margaret find me there and take gentle charge of the hour. "You're up early, she said, coming into the kitchen in her robe and pausing when she saw my face. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." "Didn't sleep well," I said. I let my voice come out slightly thinner than usual. My chest felt a little tight in the night. Probably nothing. Her eyes sharpened immediately, not with wifely concern, I understood now, but with the particular alertness of a woman monitoring a schedule. "Tight how, like before?" "I don't know," I said vaguely. "Different, maybe." She was already reaching for her phone. At 8:15, I was sitting in the kitchen chair when I put my hand to my chest, let my face crumple with pain, and tipped sideways against the table with enough force to rattle the coffee cups. "George!" Margaret's chair scraped back so hard it hit the wall. She was beside me in 3 steps, hands on my shoulders, voice climbing. "George, stay with me, I'm calling." Her fingers were already shaking over her phone screen. 911, what is your emergency? Yes, my husband. He has a heart condition. Her voice broke on the last word, and she grabbed my hand and held it so hard, the bones ached. And for one terrible, vertiginous moment, I felt the full weight of what 38 years of love looked like when it expressed itself as grip strength. Then I remembered what that love had done to my medication, and I breathed through it and kept my eyes half closed and let her hold my hand. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. They were professional, efficient, and asked me questions. I answered slowly and with deliberate confusion. What day was it? Did I know where I was? Could I squeeze their fingers? I squeezed too weakly. I got the day wrong by 2. The lead paramedic's face went carefully neutral in the way medical faces go neutral when they are deciding something. And then I was on a stretcher, and Margaret was following close behind, and the April morning was very bright and very ordinary through the ambulance doors. At the hospital, the attending physician on duty was a compact young woman named Dr. Foster, whom I had never met before and who had no connection to Shaw. She ran the standard workup EKG blood panel chest imaging with the thorough efficiency of someone who had not been told what to find. The EKG showed a mildly elevated heart rate and some irregular rhythm. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that hadn't appeared on my charts before under genuine stress. She recommended I stay for observation overnight. Standard protocol. I agreed. Shaw arrived at noon. He came through the door of my hospital room moving faster than a social visit warranted and slowed down when he saw me lying in the bed with my eyes half open and Margaret standing at the window. He adjusted his pace immediately, smooth professional, the practiced recalibration of a man who knew how to walk into rooms. But I had been watching people adjust their paces for 6 weeks, and I caught it in the half-second before he smoothed it away. He was not worried about my cardiac event. He was worried about what it meant for his timeline. George. He came to the bedside and put his hand briefly on my arm, warm, familiar. 11 years of practiced reassurance in a single gesture. I came as soon as Margaret called. How are you feeling? Confused, I said in the flat, distant voice I had been developing for 3 weeks. I'm not sure what happened. That's all right. His voice was gentle. That's completely normal after an event like this. He spoke to Margaret near the door. For a few minutes I could hear the murmur of it, the particular rhythm of 2 people coordinating. Then he came back to the bed and sat in the visitor's chair and ran me through a brief cognitive assessment day, date, year, who was the current president. I got 2 out of 4 wrong. He wrote extensively in the chart. Through the room's narrow window, I could see the hallway. Nathan was out there. He had arrived 40 minutes after the ambulance, still in the jacket he'd worn to work, standing near the nurse's station with his phone in his hand. He was typing something, and whoever he was typing to was answering quickly, and the speed of the exchange told me this was not a conversation about his father's health. He was reporting. Cruz had someone in the hospital. I didn't know who and didn't need to. Whatever Shaw wrote in that chart this afternoon was being documented by someone whose badge said something other than what it looked like. That evening, Margaret thought I was sedated. I wasn't. I had palmed the sedative the nurse offered, same technique as Shaw's sample pills. Same candy wrapper, different pocket. And I lay with my eyes closed and my breathing slow while Margaret stood just outside my door and spoke quietly into her phone. Her voice drifted through the gap. Low and certain and electric, with something that sounded almost like relief. It's time, she said. Call the attorney's office first thing tomorrow. We move this week. Make sure Nathan knows. 3 words. We move this week. I lay in the hospital bed in the dark and listened to the monitors beep their steady, meaningless rhythm, and I thought about Cruz's team, positioned and ready, and Frank with his folder of documentation, and Richard Carver's office on Broad Street, where everything that mattered was already safe. They were moving this week. So was I. They sent me home the next afternoon with a walker I didn't need, and a discharge summary I read in the car, while Margaret drove her eyes flicking to my face every 30 seconds, with an attention that had nothing to do with the road. You don't have to read that now, she said, voice soft with the particular tenderness she deployed when she wanted me to put something down. Just looking at the medication changes, I said vaguely, and let the papers drift to my lap. She reached over and patted my hand. Shaw will explain everything at the follow-up. You don't need to worry about the details. I looked out the passenger window at the Charleston streets going by the live oaks, the old houses, the ordinary beautiful city that had no idea what was happening inside one of its quieter addresses, and I said, "You're right. I don't need to worry." She squeezed my hand. I stared out the window and thought about Agent Cole. Back home, Margaret settled me into the armchair with a blanket and a glass of water, and the remote control arranged with the careful thoroughness of a woman staging a scene. She tucked the blanket around my legs and kissed my forehead and said she was going to make soup, and I thanked her, and she went to the kitchen, and 20 seconds later I heard her on the phone. She had left the kitchen door open by perhaps 3 inches, not enough to see her, enough to hear. "He's home," she said, her voice quick and low and electric, with something she was working hard to contain. "He's very weak. The hospital visit accelerated things significantly. I need the documents ready by Thursday evening." A pause. "No, he won't be a problem. Shaw's assessment from yesterday should be more than sufficient for the guardianship filing." Another pause shorter. "Just have everything prepared. I'll handle the rest." She hung up. I sat in the armchair with the blanket over my legs and my hands folded in my lap, and my face pointed at the television. I hadn't turned on, and I breathed through the thing in my chest that wanted to be rage and wasn't quite that wanted to be grief, and was past that too. Something harder and colder and more useful than either one. Thursday. She had said Thursday. Nathan and Claire arrived at 6 that evening. Nathan came through the door with the slightly dazed look of a man who had been running on insufficient sleep and too much anxiety for too long. And he hugged me at the armchair, leaning down awkwardly because I was sitting, and I felt the tremble in his arms, and thought he has no idea what's coming for him either. We ate dinner at the kitchen table, the 4 of us, and I managed my soup slowly, and said little, and let Margaret manage the conversation the way she always had. Nathan ate without tasting anything. Claire was quiet in her particular way, present, watchful, her eyes moving between Margaret and Nathan, with a calculation she had stopped bothering to fully conceal, at least from anyone paying the right kind of attention. After dinner, Nathan went to the back porch. Old habit, new cigarette. Margaret and Claire moved to the living room. I closed my eyes in the armchair and breathed slowly and listened. "After the transfer is finalized," Margaret said, her voice carrying the particular lightness of a woman discussing logistics she has rehearsed many times, "I'm planning to put the house on the market by August. Elliot has a place near Forsyth Park in Savannah. There's room, and it makes more sense than maintaining this property alone." Claire's voice even and careful. "And Nathan and I, in terms of the liquid assets, you'll be taken care of," Margaret said. "Both of you. I'll make sure of it." "Can you be more specific?" A pause. "Claire, I will take care of things, the way I always have." A beat of quiet that lasted exactly long enough for a woman to decide something. Then Claire's voice, smooth and final. "Of course, Margaret." I heard the soft click of a phone being set on a glass coffee table. The red light would be on. I was certain of it. At 11 o'clock, after Nathan and Claire had gone, and Margaret had checked on me twice and finally gone to bed herself, I pulled the prepaid phone from the pocket of my cardigan and typed to Frank with both thumbs. "Claire recorded Margaret tonight. Margaret is moving to Savannah with Shaw after the transfer. Nathan doesn't know. It's fracturing. We need to move Thursday." Frank's response came in 4 minutes. "Crews confirmed Thursday. The attorney Margaret called a man named Patterson received a call this morning advising his services are no longer required. He won't be coming Thursday evening. The man who will be there has a valid South Carolina notary commission and a federal badge. His name is Agent Cole. George, you're almost through this. I read it twice. Then I turned the phone off and set it in the drawer and sat in the dark of my study with the house quiet around me and thought about Thursday. 2 days. 40 years of a life I had built with my own hands, and it was all coming down to 2 days and a man named Cole with a badge in his briefcase. I looked up at the smoke detector above my drafting table, that blinking red light patient and steady as a heartbeat. 2 more days, I said quietly to the empty room. Then I turned off the lamp and went to bed. Thursday moved slowly the way days move when you have been counting toward them. I came downstairs that morning at 9 with my cane and my gray cardigan and the slightly unfocused expression I had been wearing for 6 weeks, eyes that moved a half-beat too slowly, a mouth that opened sometimes as if to say something, and then didn't, the particular quality of hesitation that belongs to a man whose thoughts have started arriving late to their own party. Margaret was in the kitchen. She turned when she heard me, and her whole face lifted into warmth. "Good morning, sweetheart." She crossed to me and took my arm, guiding me to my chair with a gentleness that cost me something every single time she did it. "How did you sleep?" "All right, I think," I said. "I had a dream about the Morrison project. Kept trying to remember the load calculations and couldn't get them right." She made a soft, sad sound and pressed her hand over mine. "You don't need to worry about load calculations anymore, George. That was a long time ago." "I know," I said, looking down at my coffee mug. "I know that. I just couldn't remember." Her hand tightened over mine. Not comforting. Measuring. At 7 o'clock that evening, a man knocked on the front door. He was 43 years old, compact and unremarkable, in a dark blazer, with the kind of face that didn't insist on being remembered, the perfect face I had thought, when Cruz described him for a man whose job required him to be present without being noticed. He introduced himself as Patterson attorney sent by the firm Margaret had contacted. His handshake was firm and brief. His briefcase was leather and looked expensive. When he stepped through the door, we exchanged a glance that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Everything necessary was in it. Nothing else. "Mr. Calloway." His voice was pleasantly neutral. "It's good to meet you." "And you," I said in my slow, slightly vague way. "Come in." The 4 of us gathered in my study, Margaret, Nathan, Claire, and Agent Cole with his leather briefcase and his valid South Carolina notary commission, and his federal badge folded underneath both. The documents were spread across my drafting table. I could see my name printed at the top of the first page. George Arthur Calloway. Below it, the legal architecture of a full asset. Transfer the house, the accounts, the investments, the architectural rights. Everything flowing in one direction, away from me toward Margaret. I sat in my drafting chair, the leather worn smooth, in exactly the shape of me, after 30 years of use, and I looked at the documents the way I had been practicing looking at things for 6 weeks, with the soft, unfocused gaze of a man for whom the written word had started to mean less than it used to. Margaret stood at my shoulder. "Take your time, honey. This just protects everything we built together." Nathan stood near the door with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the floor. He had not looked at me once since he arrived. The shame on his face was so naked and so total that it hurt me in a place I had not expected to still be vulnerable, because despite everything, despite the DNA result, and the emails and the theft, and the pills, he was still the boy who had been afraid of thunderstorms until he was 9 years old. Claire stood beside him. Her right hand rested loosely at her side near the pocket of her jacket. I knew what was in that pocket. Agent Cole set the pen at the top right corner of the first document. I picked it up. The room held its breath. I looked at the signature line. Then I looked up at the architectural drawings on the wall across from me. The elevation plans for this house, drawn in my own hand in 1992, every line exactly as I had intended it. The roof line, the foundation depth, the load calculations penciled in the margins in numbers so small you had to lean close to read them. 30 years this house had stood. I looked at the pen. Then I looked up at Margaret with the soft, bewildered expression I had spent 6 weeks perfecting. And I said in the slow and slightly lost voice of a man trying hard to understand something, "Margaret, what happens to the house after I'm gone?" She leaned toward me immediately, her voice going low and warm and explanatory, the voice she used when she thought I needed something simplified. "It comes to me, sweetheart. And then we can take care of Nathan's situation properly. Everything works out." Nathan made a sound near the door, low, involuntary, the sound a person makes when a word lands that they have been dreading. "Mom," he started. "It's fine, Nathan." Margaret's voice quick and certain. "He doesn't need to." "And Dr. Shaw," I said pleasantly, still in my confused old man voice, turning the pen over in my fingers as if I had forgotten what it was for. "Does he get something too? I heard you say his name. On the phone. Before the hospital." The color left Margaret's face so completely and so suddenly that I watched it happen, the warmth draining out like water from a basin, leaving something underneath that I had never seen on her before. Something stripped and certain and very afraid. "George," her voice had changed register entirely. "You were confused. You were—" "I wasn't sleeping," I said. I set the pen down on the drafting table. The sound it made was very small, a soft click of metal against wood. But in the silence of that room it landed like a load-bearing wall giving way. That particular sound of something structural letting go felt more than heard, impossible to mistake. Margaret took one step back from the table. Nathan's head came up from the floor. His eyes found my face, and what was in them was not relief and not guilt. It was something rawer than either, something that looked like a man seeing clearly for the first time in a very long time and not being sure he could stand what he was seeing. Claire's hand moved to her jacket pocket, and I looked at my wife of 38 years, across the documents that were supposed to end my life, and across 6 weeks of performance and grief and cold structural fury. And I said the 2 words I had been saving since the Monday morning in March, when I had swallowed a pill that wasn't mine, and driven to a bank, and started to understand what kind of house I was actually living in. "Not yet," I said. The 2 words landed in that room the way a structural failure lands, not with a bang, but with a shift, a groan, the sound of weight moving to places it was never designed to carry. I reached into my cardigan pocket. I placed 4 things on the drafting table, one at a time, evenly spaced, the way you lay out construction documents when you want the evidence to speak before you do. First 2 pill bottles. The original metoprolol succinate, the real one, beside the bottle that had been on my nightstand for 4 months. Different color, different size. I had kept both. Second, the toxicology report from the private lab in Colombia. 3 pages. The substitute pills identified by compound and manufacturer. Entirely different medication from what Shaw had prescribed. Third, 6 months of bank statements with the Hargrove Meridian LLC transfers highlighted in yellow. Fourth, a small digital recorder flat as a matchbook, running in my breast pocket since 7 o'clock that evening. "Everything said in this room tonight is federal evidence," I said. My voice came out low and steady, nothing like the voice I had been performing for 6 weeks. Margaret's knuckles went white against the drafting table edge. I walked her through each piece. The pills, the bank transfers, the irrevocable trust I had signed 6 weeks ago. Whatever they had brought tonight, there was nothing left to take. There hadn't been for weeks. Her legs gave out. She sat hard in the chair and pressed both hands over her mouth. Nathan in the doorway made a sound I will never forget. I held his gaze 3 full seconds. "I know," I said. 2 words carrying 40 years. His face crumpled completely. He turned toward the wall. The door opened. Detective Cruz entered with 2 federal agents. Claire stepped forward and held out her phone with both hands. 3 months of recordings. I want to cooperate fully. Margaret stood on her own before the agent reached her, straightened her jacket, lifted her chin. 3 steps from the door, she stopped. She turned and found my face. "I know you did, Margaret," I said. "That's what makes this so unbearable." She walked through the door. The house went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. The summer of 2025 was the longest of my life, not in days but in wait. Legal proceedings began in June. Frank came with food on Tuesdays. I learned to make coffee for one, which mostly meant I made too much, and stood at the kitchen window staring at the garden Margaret had tended for 26 years, trying to figure out what a man does with the things that don't disappear just because the person who made them is gone. The wisteria kept growing. The oak tree didn't care. I planted Margaret's tomato seedlings badly with a bad knee and no real idea what I was doing. 3 of the 5 survived. I considered that a reasonable outcome. The trial concluded in September. Margaret received 9 years. The judge cited the duration of the conspiracy, the forged insurance policy, the substituted medication, and the particular cruelty of targeting a husband with a genuine cardiac condition. She stood straight when the sentence was read, chin level, composed, certain, entirely present. She looked in that moment exactly like the woman I had married. I did not look away. Nathan received 3 years under his cooperation agreement. Shaw received 6 and lost his medical license permanently. Claire walked out free, her immunity secured by 3 months of recordings. Before sentencing, the judge invited me to speak. I stood without notes. "I don't stand here as a victim," I said. "I stand here as a man who spent 40 years building things meant to last. The most important structure any of us maintains is not made of steel or concrete. It is made of truth. And truth, unlike concrete, does not crack under pressure. It only becomes more visible." I visited Nathan in October. He was thinner, quieter, the brashness gone. His first question was whether I was all right. That surprised me more than anything. "Will you come back?" he asked. "Yes," I said. That's the honest answer. In November, I sat on the front porch and let my coffee go cold for the first time in 68 years. I had nothing to build that morning, except whatever came next. The porch railing I built 30 years ago was still solid, still level, not a board out of place. Some structures, if you build them right, simply hold. People ask me sometimes what I learned from all of this. I learned that God doesn't give you wisdom cheaply. He gives it to you the way a good architect gives you load calculations precisely, and only after you've stood inside the structure long enough to feel where it bends. I was a man who trusted the wrong things for too long. I trusted a title over character. I trusted proximity over honesty. I trusted the warmth of a familiar hand, without ever asking what that hand was doing when I wasn't watching. Don't be like me. Check your foundations before you need them. The people closest to you are not automatically the people safest to you. Love is real, but love has never once been a substitute for truth. My personal belief, earned the hard way, loyalty without integrity, is just a longer betrayal. These grandpa stories don't come easy to tell. This family story cost me 38 years and one very quiet Thursday evening. But if one grandpa stories like mine saves you from a similar Thursday, then it was worth every word. If this family story moved you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs it. And if you want more grandpa stories like this one, subscribe. We'll be here. Thank you for staying until the end. A note: some stories in this channel contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and education. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what nourishes you.